All right, good morning, guys. How's everybody? We have no snow. Well, still snow here, but it's not actively snowing, so that's nice. All right. So let me introduce myself. So I'm Sigan Hartley, and I'm a professor in the School of Human Ecology here on campus. And I'm a Waste Management Center investigator here. And today I want to talk a little bit about one of the studies that we're doing. And you're going to hear actually about different parts of the study from Dr. Christian, who's going to talk after me. But the part I'm going to spend my time focusing on is looking at some links between lifestyle and Alzheimer's disease and Down syndrome. So let's start by talking a little bit about what Alzheimer's disease is. So Alzheimer's disease is the most common type of dementia. So dementia means that you begin to experience problems in cognition. So we often think about memory impairments happening first, and then other types of impairments, things like the ability to shift attention, to retain information and use it flexibly. And then this is a progressive condition. So then we see declines in everyday living skills. So the ability to drive, to get dressed, to swallow, and eventually sort of motor skills. And this is a neurodegenerative condition, meaning that it affects the brain and it's progressive. So pathology sort of worsens over time. And Alzheimer's disease is the most common type of dementia, but there's other types of dementia. Currently, it's estimated that about 6.5 million Americans have Alzheimer's disease. So this would be a prevalence of about 10% of people who are age 65 and older. Here in Wisconsin, we estimate that about 120,000 people are living with Alzheimer's disease right now. And we know that the number is going to grow. So as baby boomers age, it's expected that we'll see almost a double in the prevalence. So about 12.7 million Americans are estimated to live with Alzheimer's disease by 2050. Now, Dr. Christian's going to give you a nice overview into what we know about pathology with Alzheimer's disease. But here I just wanted to highlight two sort of features which often are talked about as being hallmark features of Alzheimer's disease. And so here you can see some figures in the right. So these are brain imaging scans where you can see that one of the changes we see are increases in a protein called amyloid beta, which begin to accumulate in different areas of the brain. And so we see an increase in these proteins or plaques, these amyloid beta plaques in the brain, really beginning as we age. And then this, you can see in that bottom middle scan there, where you see all that yellow color, would mean that we begin to see elevated levels of these plaques begin to develop widespread, really prior to the onset of having dementia, and then would remain high for individuals with dementia. And then in that top set of 3 scans, you can see the other hallmark feature we see is really the accumulation of another protein called tau. And so here you can see that sort of more healthy aging in that top scan with the blue color. And then we see accumulations of tau happening prior to the onset of dementia, where you can see some of that green and yellow color in the middle scan, and then even higher rates for someone with dementia. In those bottom 2 slides, these are just illustrations of what's happening. So here in the first set, you can see really sort of an image of kind of a healthy brain here. And then in the next slide, you can see an image of what happens when we have this accumulation of amyloid beta plaques. That's sort of that tangle, and that tangle of that protein sits between neurons or nerve cells and interferes with their ability to communicate. And then tau actually hangs out within that neuron or that nerve cell. And together, sort of, we think this plays a role in other pathology that's occurring with Alzheimer's disease. So why is there a connection between Down syndrome and Alzheimer's disease? Well, when we think about Alzheimer's disease, most of us are thinking about what we call sporadic late onset Alzheimer's disease. So this accounts for the large majority of Alzheimer's disease. This is rare before the age of 50. And most people who have this sporadic late type of Alzheimer's disease are really in their late 70s and 80s. So 80% of people affected with this would be age 75 and older. That said, we do have what we call sort of these early onset types of Alzheimer's disease. So a lot of these are related to what we call autosomal dominant populations, where there's a mutation or an effect within a single gene. And so some of the known populations that we know of are amyloid precursor protein or APP mutations in chromosome 21, as well as presenilin 1 and 2, which are on chromosomes 14 and 1. And with these autosomal dominant types, we see a much earlier age of onset. So dementia really occurring more like in your 40s and 50s. So Down syndrome is much more similar to the second type, this early onset that I'm talking about. So here, the reason that we think we see this increased risk for Alzheimer's disease and Down syndrome is because people with Down syndrome have 3 copies of chromosome 21. So you can see this is a karyotype here. And so we have 3 copies of chromosome 21. And there's this gene, so here, if this is chromosome 21, there's a gene called the amyloid precursor protein, which we know can be duplicated in other people, but in Down syndrome, we have the triplication. And we think that this gene is involved in how much amyloid is sort of produced. And so we think an overexpression of this is playing a role in the increased risk for Alzheimer's disease and Down syndrome. Across studies, the lifetime risk for developing Alzheimer's disease and Down syndrome is about 90%. One thing the field has been very interested in is beginning to understand the timeline of when we begin to see changes related to Alzheimer's disease and Down syndrome so that we can better inform clinical intervention trials to be able to prevent or delay this condition. So one of the lines of research that we have been part of here at the center is really understanding if we can track early cognitive changes that might link up to these 2 proteins I talked about, amyloid beta and tau, prior to the onset of dementia, because that's when we think we really want to intervene. So here's some work. This is people who have been in our studies for up to 10 years, 120 months. And what we can see is that people who began the study without elevated levels of amyloid beta are really doing really well in this memory test. Most of them are really high, really stable. For those who began to develop amyloid beta plaques during our study, you can see a little bit of squirreliness, some people going down. But for this last group, these are people who started the study with amyloid beta plaques. They don't have dementia yet, but we're already seeing that brain pathology. Here's where we begin to track some declines, which is going to help us understand how we can enroll them in clinical trials to sort of track change. And our work, as we become more sophisticated in our own understanding, we're beginning to be able to kind of compile biomarkers to create using multiple biomarkers to help understanding. And our work is really suggesting it's actually people who have both elevated amyloid beta, but also elevated tau, who are the ones who are beginning to show these declines. And so that's sort of a group we really want to make sure we're targeting with interventions. Now, the other thing we're looking at is sort of differences within adults with Down syndrome and who might be developing faster, who might be developing slower. What do we see in terms of variability? So this is just an age trajectory. So here you see age here on this x-axis, and this is a memory, sort of a dementia and a memory test. And one thing that our research is saying is that people with Down syndrome who have a mild level of intellectual disability in the blue versus a moderate in the red versus severe and profound in the green are showing a very similar trajectory. So they start at different levels of memory and cognitive skills, but they're declining at a very similar rate. And in our studies, the mean age of dementia is about 54 years. And this is very similar to other work in the field. So this is work by Florencia Ulita out of Spain, who did this beautiful meta-analysis, which just means that she compiled findings across lots of studies. And she was finding a mean age of dementia for people with Down syndrome of 53.8 years. And this you can see in the graph here, this is this Down syndrome Alzheimer's disease group. And so the mean was very similar to these other autosomal dominant types, the other people who had a sort of single gene mutation. But for the purpose of today's talk, what I want to highlight and what I think we don't highlight enough as a field is this variability. So a mean is simply an average of all of these people. And what I want to highlight here is there is a 30+ year range, right? So even though these are individuals who share trisomy 21, we see a big range in when they begin to develop dementia. So some people are getting it in their 40s, but some people are living into their 70s and beyond without dementia. So for me, I think this is really important because it suggests that other things are going on too. And the reason that's important is because we could perhaps understand these other things and develop targets for interventions that would also leverage these other things as a way to be able to prevent and delay Alzheimer's disease and Down syndrome. So really seeing this as a way to build our toolbox that we're going to have clinical trials that might target the Alzheimer's disease pathology itself, but also could target these other things that are related to this variability. And in our lab, we're very interested. I have underlined this idea of modifiable. So I'm less interested in things that I can't change about an individual's lives. And I'm more interested in things that we have something we could do. We could actually fix this. We could address this. So today I want to spend the rest of my time just highlighting what we know, two aspects of lifestyle that we have been very focused on in our lab. The first aspect is employment activities. So in adult life, employment activities ends up being a big part of how we spend our time, right? And we know from a lot of research that employment activities gives us a sense of self-worth. It gives us a sense of belonging to a community. It helps our mental health. So we see all these advantages. We also know from research outside of Down syndrome that employment activities are actually related to risk of Alzheimer's disease, and they're related to the timing of aging-related cognitive declines. So if you're more likely to decline in your memory and your thinking skills, your processing speed, more likely to get slow or not with age. And so what I'm highlighting here, these are just a subset of the jobs of people who we have in a study. This is related to 87 adults with Down syndrome. And first I want to highlight that, wow, they're doing incredible, important jobs and a huge variety of jobs, right? So things from assembly work to bracelet making to two of our participants were enrolled in college courses. Nursery school attendant to library aide. So we have a huge range here. So what we wanted to do, and I want to highlight, this is work done by a graduate student, Brianna and Emily Schwer, who is a postdoc in the lab here today. And what we wanted to do is know what people were doing, how much time they were spending in these activities in an average week. But also what we did is we began to sort of tease apart how complex the work is. So outside of Down syndrome, the idea is that whether you work and how many hours you work has associations with risk for Alzheimer's disease. But it's also sort of how much is challenging you to think and to have to be flexible and to have to sort of do different types of things in your day-to-day. And so the three ways that we sort of think about complexity is one, data or information complexity. So this would be things like, do you need to constantly use new information, apply information? So an example, so here we can just see we coded people in the range of how informationally complex their job was. An example of someone who had a really high complex job would be the library aide, because they were doing inventories of books that were missing, and then they were having to code them or organize them in a specific coding system. So it actually required them to use a lot of information in sort of flexible ways. We also look at people complexity. So this is how much do you have to interact socially and sort of do that social back and forth. An example of someone who had a job that was high in people complexity was somebody who was a hostess at a restaurant. They had to greet people, they had to figure out where they wanted to sit, how many people were in your party, and then they had to navigate them to the table. And then we look at things complexity. So this is how much you're sort of manipulating objects. So examples of jobs with high things complexity were some of the higher end assembly work, as well as a lot of janitorial work, where you actually have to really think hard about how to clean this item, how to maneuver this item, where these items go. So what we wanted to know is how is employment complexity going to be related to aging and Down syndrome? So to do this, we looked across two different time points. So we're going to call these for this study cycle 1, where people came in and they told us what they're doing in their job, We also looked at their memory and dementia skills. So some of these are direct measures where we show them pictures and ask them to remember them. Some they're like a caregiver came to the study with them and would talk about how well they're doing. And so then they came in again about 16 to 20 months later, and we reassessed how are these memory skills and what are their dementia symptoms. And so what we found is that people, and in these models, were controlling for age, their level of intellectual disability, and how many hours they spent in the job. And what we found is that people who were doing jobs that had a lot of people complexity and things complexity actually showed less decline in their cognitive functioning across these 16 to 20 months. So it was sort of this idea that like you're using your cognitive skills and you're better able to maintain them then over time. You're sort of more resilient to some of these aging related declines. We know that employment is not all we do in our day, right? As adults, we do a lot of things outside of employment. Leisure is one category of these things we like to do outside of our employment. So this is another work by a graduate student at Yulia who looked at employment activities. I just have listed some of the, leisure activities, some of the leisure activities people reported doing. We had a whole host. So she wanted to look at if people who are doing more leisure activities have a similar effect. Can we see this sort of like brain reserve mechanism, cognitive reserve mechanism where we see less decline? So what she found is that people who were doing a high level of social leisure and just a high number of overall leisure, when we looked across all categories, they actually, you can see here, so here a higher number would be more decline in memory on a acute recall task where we're asking them to remember information. So here they were flatter, meaning they're not declining in cognition, even with increasing amyloid beta over this. This was actually a 3-year period compared to those who had a low level of social leisure and a low level of overall leisure. So again, suggesting that if we could really modify and get people to kind of engage in different ways, use your brain flexibly, we actually might be able to help maintain cognitive functioning for longer. So just implications of this, is that we are seeing that people who are more complex employment in terms of people and things, we're reporting less cognitive decline across 16 to 20 months. And leisure, so employment, starting people and things, and leisure activity was also related to less cognitive decline, even in the face of increasing AD pathology. So for me, one of the big take-home efforts of this, as we longitudinally continue to tease this apart, is understanding if it is important as a group and as a field, we begin to advocate for more social policy and intervention to make sure people have opportunities to engage in employment activities and activities that are meaningful and sort of challenging, right? That have that nice level of complexity. The other area I just want to highlight that we've really focused on recently is looking at physical activity as another way that we might be able to delay the onset of Alzheimer's disease and these cognitive declines in people with Down syndrome. So here's some work by Tori Fleming, who is also a graduate student here today. And what we do is we have adults with Down syndrome in our study. We're this accelerometer, this wrist-worn sort of device like a Fitbit, for 7 days and 7 nights, and it tracks how physically active they are across that period of time. And so we look at 2 markers because we actually found that both of these 2 markers are important, and they actually are not the same. They have separate effects. So one is that the time spent in sedentary behavior, just sort of sitting around, had negative effects on cognitive functioning and memory, visual motor skills. And then people who engaged in more moderate activity, so got your heart rate up a little bit for a greater percentage of time across that week, they actually were showing better performance on memory and visual spatial performance, attention, and a host of skills. And for this work, it's been interesting because we're wanting to understand what is the mechanism. Why is physical activity maybe helping to improve cognition? We think there's likely lots of pathways. Our initial work was suggesting it may be less directly related to amyloid and tau, those 2 proteins I talked about, but it may be related to overall brain health. And we know that Alzheimer's disease pathology is sort of directly impacting a brain. And so if we think about the overall brain health is also important in understanding the sort of multiple effects that we're going to see. Tori's work suggested it really affected white matter. So white matter is more of the axons of these nerve cells, or the ways that the neurons in your brain are communicating. And so we think about association tracks. The two tracks that we found were linked to physical activity are here in this red and here in the blue. And so really thinking about the brain being able, neurons in your brain connecting across the brain more efficiently is what we're looking at with white matter. So suggesting that people who are sitting around less and engaged in more moderate activity are having a more efficient sort of connections or communications across your brain. So what's the implication of this research? Well, this is Daniel, a gentleman who's in our study, who is our model here. And one of the things we're trying to do is just get the word out about these important associations that we actually do see that physical activity helps brain health, helps your cognitive health. And so this was from a newsletter we put out of just some tips of ways to sort of stay fit and active in everyday life. And these are sort of efforts we're really excited to partner with our community partners. I had a great conversation with Gigi's Playhouse about ways that we can help support adults with Down syndrome in staying active in meaningful ways as a way to sort of improve aging and maybe delay some of the effects of Alzheimer's disease. And I'll just end by saying thank you. The research that we're part of is part of these big multi-site studies that takes a lot of effort, both here at the center, but also elsewhere. You're going to hear from Brad at about soon, Brad Christian, and he'll talk about the efforts we collaborate on all these projects. I want to give a shout out to Maria and Danny, who are outreach coordinators, and Nicole and Renee, who also do a lot of the outreach. And of course, most thank you to the families who participate in our studies. And we love getting to hang out with them and hear about updates and see them about every 16 months. So I think we might have time for one quick question, and then if there's anything. If not, we can see questions. Yes.
Yes, is the prevalence of Alzheimer's Down syndrome, is that higher if you have a member that passed away with dementia?
That is a wonderful open question. So we know that that people with Down syndrome have all the other potential genetic risks that people without Down syndrome have, right? So APOE4 allele is sort of a gene that's linked to risk for Alzheimer's. So I would say that's actually an active question. Research today has been a little bit mixed. But that's something that our team and others are actively looking at, is whether you're going to see this added risk for all the other genes that are risk factors outside of Down syndrome, how much? So it's an open question, but yeah, really important one.
This is quick one. So for your study, there was that like modifiable lifestyle changes and things like that. Were they all starting with a very similar level of plaques and tangles at that time? So they were all kind of like baseline the same? Yeah.
That's a great question. We see a range, and Dr. Christian's going to talk a little bit about that. So, you know, the same, we see some pretty clear patterns on like averages, but there is a range in sort of where they're going with it. So like in the physical activity ones, it wasn't linked to plaques at that time, but it was linked to sort of white matter degeneration. We think inflammation is going to play a role. So it didn't seem to matter. So they were starting with different levels, but it didn't seem to matter, at least for physical activity. Yeah, so great question. Yeah. All right, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Christian.